I recently watched the much-awaited Coming to America sequel. It stars Eddie Murphy trying to turn his newly discovered American son into a proper heir for the Zamundan throne. Now, my thoughts about this movie are much like a lot of people. I wasn't a fan. But honestly, I wasn't a fan of the first one either. As an African, I know that this movie was not made for me. But putting that aside, their attempt to put together an African country untouched by colonialism got me thinking about the pre-colonial African societies. The thing about this movie is that it happened almost entirely at the Zamundan Palace. What was life like for the actual Zamundans? Does anybody know? Seeing that palace smack dab in the middle of a jungle, for me, brought parallels to the palace of the former president of DRC, Mobutu Sese Seko. The palace, along with the town that it was located in, was sometimes referred to as the Versailles of the jungle. Now I know, it was just a movie. Interestingly enough though, the 8 episodes on Bunyoro history that I've told were very, very, very court-centric, like this movie. And so, in today's episode, I'm going to attempt to move away from that and talk about the people themselves. I'm going to talk about their everyday lives, their jobs, their families. This should give us insight into what life was like in the pre-colonial Bunyoro state. So, without much ado, here's episode 10 in the Banyoro series. Welcome. My name is David Ibanda. I'm the host of the podcast, Those Who Came Before Us. For what might be the umpteenth time I've said this, Bunyoro was divided into 3 groups. The Bakama, the kings, at the top, the Bahuma, the cattle herders, and the Bairu, the agriculturalists, at the bottom. Now, as I mentioned in episode 9, these are not the only classifications that they had for their people. Within these were clans. Clans are defined as a group of people with shared heritage, shared customs, and shared totems. Bunyoro has a lot of clans. John Roscoe initially wrote that there were 46 of them. He later amended this when he realized that there were far more. The list increased to a whopping 123 clans, the most notable ones being the Basita, the Babito, the Bamuli, the Bagabo, etc. And each one of these had a totem. For those who don't know, totems are animals, items, or body parts that clans hold in reverence. This could range from lions to elephants to tongues of animals, and even to the strange like woman who seduces a kraal owner's son and gets pregnant. Now, some clans actually had 2 totems, an example being the Babito, who I mention are the ruling clan. They have the bushbuck, which is called Ngabi Bunyoro, as their totem. But they also have rainwater from the roof of a house as a totem as well. I'll get to why this is the case in a little bit. This might not make sense to people, but another thing to note is that totems are usually characterized by avoidance. The Babito cannot eat or hunt the bushbuck, and in the case of rainwater on one's roof, you cannot use it. Some might ask, well, then what about the woman who seduces the kraal owner's son and gets pregnant? In that case, the clan will not allow her to enter the kraal and or talk to her in-laws. Which, of course, is extremely sad, considering that it takes 2 to tangle, if you know what I mean. Okay, so we might ask ourselves, why do clans pick their totems, and how? Honestly, I don't know. I have no answer to give you. I've searched high and low, and I can't find anything that describes why clans pick their totems and how. But perhaps the answer lies in the study of totems in other parts of the world. Because yes, you can find totems in India, Polynesia, Australia, and other places. I did, however, find a story that attempts to explain the reason for a particular totem. This story was about the Bagabo clan, one of the older clans of Bunyoro. Like the Babito, they have 2 totems, the tailless cow as the main one, and the crested crane as the secondary one. The crested crane is Uganda's national bird, one of stunning beauty with white, black, red, brown, and yellow feathers, which, as you might notice, matches the colors of the Ugandan flag, minus the brown, of course. According to Sir James George Fraser, he was told by the Bagabo clan in Uganda, yes, there were clans with the same names in different territories, sometimes related, sometimes not, that nobody remembers why the tailless cow was picked as a totem, but that they do, however, remember why the crested crane was picked. His informant told him that one day a newly married bride was walking home with her friends. For some unexplained reason, she was left alone for a little bit. While she waited, the poor girl got hungry, and she started to eat some fruits that she found on the ground. When the friends came back, they were apparently disgusted with her and jeered at her, which I presume they did this. That's what jeering means in Uganda. And so, overcome with shame, the bride ran towards a flock of crested cranes, and upon reaching them, morphed into one of them and flew away. From then on, the crested crane became their totem. Is this story true? Of course not. It's not true. Let's focus on something that we can actually answer. How is it that some clans have two totems? It turns out that this actually represents the merger of two separate clans. Groups would join hands for a variety of reasons, such as shared livelihood, uniting against a common enemy, and also if they had newly immigrated to the Great Lakes region. Joining another more established clan helped them get situated in the new land. As Carol Buchanan explains it, clanship in the Kitara complex emerges upon closer examination as a strategy, a principle of organization in terms of alliances and assimilation, ordering within and between clans. And when they merged, Bunyoro historian Nsamba mentions that clans kept their totems when joining another group. He offers an example of the Babito, who united 60 clans that had the bushbuck as their totem. This merger allowed them the strength in numbers that they needed in order to challenge the second dynasty of Bunyoro, known as the Butchery. The Babito emerged as the victors and began their reign as the third dynasty around the 16th century. Clans became allies or merged as one entity by way of the Omukago ritual. I mentioned this ritual in episode 2, when Isaza refused to get into a blood brotherhood bond with the underworld king Nyamunyonga. This was the custom of forging strong bonds between groups by ingesting a coffee bean with the other's blood on it. After this, the two men would be brothers. And it didn't just bond them, it bonded their families too. From then forth, them and their families were obligated to come to the aid of each other at all costs. It was through this that clans would become bigger and have a better chance of survival. And I mentioned earlier that they usually join due to shared livelihoods. This is by far the biggest reason for the merger between clans, not kinship, as one might expect. For example, one of Bunyoro's oldest clans is the Basita. They trace their heritage to Ethiopia, from which a great drought and forest fire forced them to leave and move southward. Except back then, there were 6 clans, or possibly even more. These were the Bagoma, the Bahika, the Bajwangu, the Bakasura, the Bajajimi, and the Basura. They arrived in Uganda and joined a clan with the Ntimba cow totem, which means the red-spotted cow. In time, they became known as the Basita. In fact, today, these past groups are considered subclans of the Basita, and collectively, they are known for their metalworking skills. The same is true for clans like the Bayaga, who were known for their expertise in water navigation. According to Nsamba, they had great knowledge of the winds and stars, and this allowed them to travel at night and on water with ease. In fact, the name Bayaga comes from the word Muyaga, which means wind. They were the clan that people would go to for help crossing the rough waters of Lake Albert, which was then known as Lake Mwitanzige, which means locust killer. This is also reflected in the story of their origin. It was said that this clan was created by a man called Chisehe. Now, one day, misfortune fell upon Chisehe when he awoke to find that all his cows had disappeared. He soon found out that this was because of an incident involving the cows of his maternal uncle, Ntumo Yamunyonyi. You see, Ntumo was a wealthy man. He owned many cows around the kingdom, and it was said that within his herd, he had no bulls. Yet his cows were somehow able to reproduce. This was because of a star called Rununuzi, which literally translates to beautiful star, would, for lack of a better word, bless them at night. Now, during this process, no one was allowed to witness this divine act or to make any noise at that point. It just so happens that a curious individual did just that, and upon witnessing the miracle, he let out a scream. This triggered the sudden vanishing of Ntumo's cows and Chisehe's by extension. Does that make sense? Because Chisehe was related to Ntumo. It also seems to have affected a lot of other people by extension as well. And as such, famine struck the land because a lot of people lived on milk exclusively. Side note, cattle clans were said to do this. They were said to live on milk exclusively. How they did it is beyond me. So, Chisehe just so happened to be married to a woman of an agricultural background. In other words, a Mwiru of the Banyoro class. She helped him plant some pumpkin seeds, and using cow dung as manure, within 2 months, they had a lot of pumpkins to not only feed themselves, but also to be able to sell to other hungry people. However, Chisehe and his family lived in Bulega, which is in present-day Eastern Congo. In order to get to Bulega, you have to cross the Lake Albert. And so it is said that Chisehe's son Mihingo gained knowledge of wind direction, and using his newfound skills, was able to help people cross the lake to Bulega where they could trade. Now, I'm going to go ahead and end this story right here because there's a lot left, but I think you guys get the idea. The Bayaga gained knowledge of wind direction and were able to navigate the lake using canoes. However, this ability doesn't just stop with water. They would be called upon to track cows and other lost items using the wind. It was said that they had magical objects that they used to do this. These magical objects were a pair of horns made from the mutumo, which is a fig tree, and musambia tree, which I don't know the English name of. This pair of horns was worn by the head of the clan, and using a string attached to it, was able to tell the direction of wind and where one needed to go. This is where we start getting into the Bachwezi territory, and the religion of Kubandwa, because the Bachwezi were said to wear horns of the same make. And in fact, one of the leaders of the Bayaga was the Machwezi Mulindwa, the one who was infamously dunked in a pit of hot water or spikes, depending on the story that you read. So it's pretty interesting stuff. And again, this is true for other clans. Some would become big enough to form polities that commanded a lot of political power in the region, and over time, their power would wane and another would take over. Such was the nature of state formation before the establishment of Bunyoro as a state. But as Nsamba mentions, there's still a lot that we don't know about these early polities. This is just what we know for now. And so as you can see, there are more occupations than just cattle herding and agriculturalism. Shane Doyle tells us that ironworks were by far the most important product of the kingdom. And as I mentioned, clans like the Basita organized themselves around the skill of metalwork. They took pride in their work, despite the occupational hazards that came with the job. Mines, by default, are dangerous environments to be working in. But the Basita, they would descend into these mine shafts and get the metals that they needed. In fact, they had a saying that went, Alimirwa enyangai kaire, o Musita wembari, which translates to, a member of the Basita clan has his grave dug when he is alive. This tells you all that you need to know about the nature of the job. Deaths were common in these mines. To get ready for a day's work, the Basita would pray to Rukohewe Nambo, the spirit of the mine, to get her blessings and ask for safety. And during ceremonies, she was depicted as wearing a dirty skin like the ones her adherents wore in the mines. Okay, so I might have started off a little bit dark, but once these minerals were collected, they would get turned into products that were famed for their durability in the region. Bunyoro was filled with metal deposits, and their location at one of Africa's cultural crossroads allowed them access to markets of other people who did not smelt, such as the Lungi and the Iteso. Now, there's a whole process to this. John Roscoe outlines this in his book Bakitara. Metals would pass through the hands of 3 types of workers, the first being the Bajuguzi, otherwise known as the smelters. This job involved a variety of job skills. They had to carefully pick the trees to make charcoal, specifically the ones called Nkola, Mireme, and Mirongo. And upon doing this, they had to observe a number of rituals to ensure that the iron melts. It wasn't just about heat, For the Banyoro, having sex with your wife before you finish the process of making charcoal was a gigantic no-no. As soon as you got your trees, you go straight to your wife, you hand her some for firewood, and then you proceed to make the charcoal. There's no visiting the sugar walls for a quick slurp. Nah, that comes after. If the walls in the mine happen to cave in, everyone would know that someone must have wriggled their worm in their wife's pond instead of making the damn charcoal. After that, about 10 to 20 men headed to the mine to begin the dig. Oh, I forgot to mention, they also doubled as miners. There's a lot of hats to put on here. But of course, first thing they had to do was to propitiate the mine spirit and then get to work. The men actually stayed at these mines. They set up homes there. And this was going to take a few days. And during this time, Roscoe tells us that the men observed a number of taboos. One in particular was that men were not allowed to wash themselves until the job was done. One can only imagine the stank in the area. But in addition, each man apparently had their own special omens that they were supposed to watch out for. This was given to them by the medicine man before their work. For instance, one man would be told to turn back if he encountered a woman on his way to work. Another could be told to turn back if he met another man on his way to the site. And this went on and on. For somebody else, it could be a dog. The Banyoro were very, very superstitious people, and they had to observe these omens lest the iron doesn't melt or harm befalls the individual in the mine. So, after getting these metals, they would then get taken to the furnace. Now, this furnace was a round pit which is about 18 meters wide and 2 feet deep. Its walls and bottom were lined with clay. The furnace would be covered with a clay top with a hole in the middle that acted as a chimney. Around it, 4 tunnels would be built, through which blast pipes would be attached to the furnace. These blast pipes were then connected to pot bellows. Bellows like those accordion-looking thingies. I know, very descriptive, but Google it. Having seen it, it's kind of hard to explain what a pot bellow is, or would look like, but I found a picture of an indigenous furnace from southwestern Ethiopia that uses pot bellows as well, so that should give you an idea of what the Banyoro were working with. And I'll put that up on the Instagram page. Remember, TWCBU Pod on Instagram. Again, TWCBU Pod. These pot bellows worked by being covered by a goat skin on top of which a stick was attached to. So by bringing the goat skin up and down with the stick, air would be funneled through the pipes straight into the furnace, thereby keeping the blast alive. After that, the smelted metals would be chopped up into lumps which were then sold to the omusami, which in English would be the pig iron workers. And these guys were the true middlemen. They acted as a shop from which the smiths would get their metals from. The omusami, the pig iron workers, would break the iron into more appropriate sizes for a particular job. Say, if a blacksmith wanted to make a spear, a omusami would cut up the right size and charge about 100 to 150 cowrie shells for it. If they wanted to make a hoe, they would charge up to 200 cowrie shells, or barter for it. Perhaps a goat, or whatever these two men could work out. So, real quick, I wasn't going to say this, but I feel like I must. I hope you know that when I say hoe, I'm referring to the garden tool and not Santa's famous words, because that's exactly what you were thinking, right? Okay, just wanted to make sure. The omusami would work with a similar but smaller furnace than the one the smelters used. They would then move the hot metals to the anvil, which was called ibala, and used a big hammer which was called muhindo and would break them into small pieces, or pieces as they saw fit. When the blacksmiths called mwesi in Bunyoro would buy the lumps, they would have to observe a number of taboos in order to make sure that everything was right. Picking out the right trees for charcoal required the abstinence of sex. Only after he had made the clay pot bellows for his furnace was he to lay with his wife. Roscoe says that this was to ensure that the pots worked well. Clearly, intercourse was believed to be somehow linked to the process of metalwork, but how exactly isn't really explained. The smiths would go through the process of picking an anvil to work on, or building the workstation properly, and the specific hammer and chisel that will be used. These processes are long and rife with taboos, so it might not be the best idea to go through them step by step. However, if you are interested, DM me on the Instagram page and I'll put up an ironworking post. Or maybe I'll just do it anyways. I'll probably put up some info on the iron making process of the Haya people. They have an ancient metalworking process that could turn iron into steel from about 2,500 years ago. It's remarkable and relevant to the study of metalwork in Africa. In any case, the blacksmiths would create a variety of items such as knives, spears, hoes, needles, and bracelets. Some of this metal was used as decorations and regalia. We see this on the Banyoro crown called Robosungu. These metal spikes are, according to Nsamba, iron rod money that was of the Muddy tribe origin. He recounts a story where two men from the Muddy tribe recognized these spikes and arrows in the Banyoro throne room. According to them, similar spikes were used as currency among the Muddy. This isn't unique to them at all. Iron rod money has been used by many other cultures. There is also the kissy penny from West Africa, and there's also another version that was used in ancient Greece. Now, you might ask yourself what happened to this technology. Well, as I'm sure most of you know, the advent of colonialism contributed to the loss of native knowledge in the region. Banyoro continued to practice metalwork. In fact, Bunyoro hoes and knives were said to be the best in the region in 1910. However, the poor could not afford to buy these items anymore. What, with the introduction of a money-based economy and the fact that they had to compete with German clones of their products that lasted 3 to 4 times longer? Don't forget that they had been summarily trampled by the British. The British government did try to save the local industry, not out of the goodness of their hearts or the value that they saw in keeping the practice alive, but mostly because they did not like the fact that the imported iron products were German instead of British. So to end this dependence on German steel, or rather compete against it, the administration purchased a Catalan forge and trained Banyoro in European methods of blacksmithing. The only way to make iron was in a factory not using, and I quote, barbarous methods. Like why everything gotta be barbaric, you know? An African could sneeze and they'd say something along the lines, "Oh, did you see that Mosley? He didn't use a handkerchief. Savage. A handkerchief is one of the hallmarks of a true civilization." For an apparently superior people, they were obsessed with proving their dominance. This attempt failed due to the fact that the factory was way too far from the mines, and at the time, transport was a huge problem. Roads had to be constructed and there were no trucks to carry all that product to the factory. Previously, the Banyoro would do their work not so far away from where they got the iron ore. A central factory was just not feasible. Another key product that the Banyoro produced was salt. Salt was a much coveted item in the region, and Banyoro had access to two very ancient sources called Chibiro and Katwe. Katwe later fell under control of Toro when they seceded from Banyoro in 1830. They were then reconquered in 1876 by Omukama Kabalega of Banyoro. To this day, salt is still being made the same way that it was made centuries ago. What makes these two places particularly noteworthy is the way that they harvested the salt. You see, every dry season in Uganda, which would be June to August and December to February, the lake levels are low enough that people can walk on the bed of them in some parts. Now, this exposes saline springs that are usually covered up by the lakes. In order to get this salt, the Banyoro would spread sand or fresh soil on the ground and leave it there for a while, until it had been permeated with salt water. They would then scrape this salted soil and put it in sacks. The salted water is then mixed with water into a pot with a perforated bottom, which would then be placed above a pot to drain into. That way, most of the unwanted sediment remains at the top while the more concentrated salt extract seeps through to the bottom. What is left is then slowly boiled away, leaving behind salt. Shane Doyle wrote that the extract was about 97.6% sodium chloride, which is pretty pure. The process of salt making from beginning to end was mostly done by women. It isn't mentioned if these women were of a specific clan like some occupations, so I can't really say. It is arduous work though, and it's work that has sustained these communities on the lake shores for over 900 years. Since it's hard to grow food there, people relied on salt and fishing, which they would then trade with other communities to get what they needed. Now, despite growing its own food, Banyoro would buy plantains from the Baganda and the Basoga, millet, simsim, and sorghum from the Lango, and maize from Kavirondo, items which were then sold in many of Bunyoro's markets, such as the Nkwali market, which is said to have been about 300 years old. Each market was owned by the king and taxed by his tax collectors called the Wahoza. He also owned markets in other areas under Bunyoro's influence, such as in northern Busoga and Teso in eastern Uganda, especially during the zenith of the kingdom's power in the 1880s. Food was the most common commodity sold at the markets. Bunyoro would grow and sell its share of food as well. Fields were cultivated by the wider class, and when it came to farming, the Banyoro would practice intercropping, which is a practice of growing more than one crop on a field. The benefits of this are that it takes advantage of the soil's nutrients that a single crop would not otherwise utilize. It also reduces weeds, crop disease, pest attacks, and soil erosion. With this method, it ensures that only the worst weather would lead to total crop failure. If that happened, then the Blood Brotherhood Pact would come into play. This is when your friends would come to your aid. If not, you would need to go and make friends who would then be willing to share their crops. But of course, there was also the king and the chiefs, because remember, it was ultimately his responsibility to provide for his people. And we see this demonstrated in Kabalega's time. During the famine caused by the endless wars during that time period, Kabalega imported millet from Lango. He also demanded that the rich share their extra food with those who didn't have any. Furthermore, he established state-run farms for the express purpose of providing famine relief. Man, this flies in direct contrast to the starving African narrative, or that Africans are somehow unable to help themselves and need the help of the white man. The Banyoro also had underground granaries called kasenda, where they stored millet. These would later prove to be invaluable to the British Empire's forces as they fought their way to subjugate Bunyoro during the 6-Year War. Now, these were of course stored up by local farmers as tribute to their chiefs, but by a mile, the bulk of the farming was done by the women. According to Shane Doyle, many informants labeled their forefathers as useless. Wow. Tell us how you really feel. When it came to farming, the women dug, weeded, reaped, and did all the threshing. Men, in particular poor men, were said to participate in some areas, especially when it came to banana plantations. Like, for instance, they would be the ones responsible for clearing the land in order to plant the crops. With this, they would make enough to feed themselves and pay taxes by giving surpluses to the chiefs. But one of the things that was paramount to the increase of one's surpluses was his or her family. The bigger your family, the more work you could get done, and thus you would have more food. This is where having a large family was beneficial. Bunyoro was a very proto-colonialist society. Children were seen as a source of wealth. As one early colonial missionary put it, kids represented a man's greatness in life. You see this with the third Babito king Onyonyimba, who was given the name Kabambai Guru, which meant he had enough children to populate the sky. Some say he had 200 kids. Others say he had 4,000. We, of course, don't know if this was true, but the point is made that children were very important. And how do you get children? You get married. The song you're hearing is a Bunyoro wedding song recorded by Hugh Tracy in the 1950s. In the old days, marriages were almost always arranged by the parents. It could even be arranged before the bride and groom were even born. One could say to a close friend, "Hey, my wife is pregnant. I give my child to you." This is of course the case if the child turns out to be a girl. If it does, then that girl will marry the son of the close friend. If that child is a boy, then you can forget the entire thing. Beattie states that a father doesn't give away a son, only daughters. Now, in regular cases, there were a whole host of things that one must pay mind to when choosing a mate. For example, it is absolutely forbidden to marry someone of the same clan. One can't even marry into his mother's, grandma's, or father's clan. He can marry into his paternal grandmother's clan, but the relationship between the families and clans must not be close. This exclusivity is not unique to the Banyoro, by the way. Many other groups in the area practice this as well. This is, of course, to avoid incest. The rule of thumb here seems to be that if it even whiffs of incest, throw it out. Typically, marriages happened between clans that were close, of course, taking into account the earlier considerations, but usually they were people that they knew. As a matter of fact, Banyoro approved of weddings between neighbors, the benefit being that one would know the type of family that they would be engaging with, as is usually the case everywhere else. You come from a good family, that's a go-ahead, that's a good thing. One was ready to get married usually when they became adults. Shane Doyle tells us that for girls, that age was very young. We can assume as soon as they hit puberty. Same thing with boys, they would just be a little bit older, usually after they had had their lower teeth removed. It was customary for Banyoro men to have their lower teeth removed sometime between the ages of 12 and 17. Only after that could they consider getting a partner. Once a suitor was picked, the prospective bridegroom, along with a few of his clansmen, would go to the girl's home to introduce themselves and negotiate. This whole process could take weeks to months and would usually be handled by intermediaries from the two families. This is when the dowry would be discussed. The bride's father never spoke directly to the suitor because it was beneath him to engage in the hagglings over bride price. The bridegroom and his people would put on their best clothes. They would show up on their best behavior and show up with a gift of a large goat and 5 jars of banana beer. It was very important to make a good impression lest they be fined. Not that they weren't going to get fined anyways. Usually the girls' intermediaries would find some sort of small infraction to penalize them for. The idea here is to impress upon the groomspeople that they are below them, because they are the ones who are asking for the bride's hand in marriage. After the back and forth and the requested bride price is paid, the bride is then brought to the groom's home. She is veiled in barcloth and escorted by her people. There's lots of singing and dancing along the way. The bride and groom also participate in a series of ceremonial rites, which include sitting on the groom's parents' laps and the invocation of the family's butchery spirits. Each clan is said to have had their own butchery spirit. After that, the marriage is consummated and it is followed by several days and nights of celebration. Most people practiced monogamy. However, it was polygamy that was most desired. The ability for a man to marry more than one woman was largely due to wealth. One bride price is exorbitant enough, now imagine 2 or 3, especially since the bride price itself was largely determined by how wealthy the groom's family was. The Bairu, the agriculturalists, would pay anywhere between 5 to 25 goats. This is why Doyle describes marriage in Bunyoro not as just a bringing together of two people, but also as an avenue for wealth redistribution. Poor people oftentimes could not afford dowry, so the only way to get married was to borrow the payment, or pledge themselves to work for someone who could pay them. Other times, the girl's parents would allow the wedding to take place, despite the insufficient funds. However, by doing this, it allowed them control and power over their daughter's husband. Now, either way, the girl's father always had authority over his son-in-law. In fact, Beattie mentions the dynamic between them, that a lot of sons-in-laws bemoan the over-authoritativeness of their fathers-in-law. For example, custom demanded that he visit his father-in-law regularly, and that he mustn't show up empty-handed. He has to show up with gifts for him. Beattie explicitly states that Banyoro often say that the fathers rule their daughters' husbands. So by allowing him to marry his daughter without fully paying him, he had effectively doubled the existing authority that his father-in-law had over him, because now he had the right to collect a portion of his earnings until the debt was paid off. Now, you might have noticed that the girl doesn't seem to be a part of the negotiations. And it's true, she doesn't. Marriage was a transaction carried out by men and for men. She was in reality an item being traded. She was expected to be submissive, kneel whenever she hands him anything, and to cater to the needs of her husband. That kneeling thing also is very much practiced by other groups as well. The Baganda do this as well, the Basoga, and even the Banyoro. There's possibly others that do it too. That being said, she definitely had rights. If mistreated, a woman could tell her family, and that would sour relations between the two groups. Divorce was allowed only as a last resort in Bunyoro. A woman could leave her husband if she was able to repay the dowry that her husband had paid for her. This was done using the help of her family and her clan, of course provided they had the finances to do so. This began to change during the colonial era, as women grew more independent of their husbands. She could grow her own cash crops, such as coffee and tobacco, and make enough money to pay back her bride price and therefore leave him. And as you might imagine, this caused a lot of hurt egos. Banyoro men would literally comment that women were out of control. The issue of domestic violence was also common, and I mentioned that the girl's family would get involved. However, it wasn't just them, but the neighbors too. Banyoro had certain expectations of their neighbors, and coming to their aid was certainly one of them. So what did it mean to be a good neighbor in pre-colonial Banyoro? Okay, let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, a couple moved into a village. In order to see what sort of neighbors they had, the couple devised a plan. One that was Oscar-worthy, or in some other people's opinion, somewhat of a nuisance. The plot involved the husband pretending to beat his wife as she screamed for help. In reality, he would be beating a goatskin while the wife put on the performance of her life. That night, they got to work. The wife screamed bloody murder as a stroke struck the goatskin.
Why are you running? Why are you running?
Not a single soul showed up to help. The couple knew what sort of neighbors they had, and so the very next day, they packed up and left, never to return again. The end. So what does the story tell us? It's clear from the story what sort of values the Banyoro have when it comes to neighborly relations. To be a good neighbor was to come to the aid of those who lived next to you. If someone was in danger, they would call out, or as Beattie would call it, a loud ululation. All able-bodied men must heed that call if they hear it, and if you don't, people are watching. At the time of Beattie collecting this information, this was an offense that was punishable in a chief's court. Maybe this was a case in pre-colonial times? As well, it's kind of hard to know. However, one was expected to take an interest in their neighbors as well. You know the drill. Say hello, check in on them. You need help building a house? Be right there, partner. You need help working your field? Say no more. But this also goes both ways. It was expected that the one being helped would provide a meal for those who were helping. And indeed, this was the case when guests showed up at your house unannounced in the middle of a meal. This I can definitely attest to. Growing up, guests who showed up at mealtime were provided for and allowed to spend the night. This value of hospitality is very common in East Africa. The guests being offered the food had to eat what was given to them, lest they risked insulting their hosts. A refusal was taken as suspicion that the host had poisoned the food. Eating and drinking was in many ways a communal activity, a way for people to get together and enjoy each other's company. In fact, it was strange for a man to eat by himself. It was something that could get you fined by an informal group of neighbors. There ain't no introvert or antisocial behaviors going on here. You're expected to come out, eat, and drink beer with your neighbors. Why are you avoiding people? Are you a sorcerer? The idea of a person living away from others was treated with great suspicion. I should note, though, that beer parties were usually for men only. Women were not allowed to be there. It was very much one of those boys-only things, an activity for men to bond and enjoy each other's company. This is reflected in the song that you hear in the background. It is a song that is sung by men at beer parties and talks about a man who invited his friends over and spoke inspiring words to them. The reply by the guests was, "We were pleased with your words." And I imagine that the host got up in a drunken stupor, beer in hand, and shouted, I love you guys. And they all went, hey. Nah, I'm just kidding. Now, just like all human societies, conflict was inevitable. And when disputes arose, there had to be a way to handle them. This was usually done through neighborhood committees. But first, someone had to put forward a case. Once they did, a committee or jury of sorts was put together to help rule the case. The selection process involved finding people who were skilled in arbitration due to their involvement in previous cases, and those who had knowledge of the situation or something that was helpful to the matter. Others could attend this court as well, but they had to be members of the community with a good reputation. No drunkards or the like were allowed. The accused and the complainant would make their cases along with the help of eyewitnesses. After this, the jury would deliberate until they had reached a decision. The one found guilty had to bring beer and meat to the complainant's house. If the accused accepted this ruling, there would be a feast and the matter would be considered closed. This is, of course, not how every case was handled. These were usually minor ones. So that explains the sort of kumbaya sort of ending. Beattie mentions the importance that the Banyoro put on restoring village harmony when broken. If the accuser rejected this ruling, this case would be kicked up the ladder to the chief. Cases that went to the chief were usually heavier crimes. For the most part, Banyoro villages tried to settle things in-house before taking it to the chief. For one to do so demonstrated a rejection from the community. It could also be seen as disrespectful or as if they're saying that they don't trust their neighborhood. This is specifically for minor cases. If it's small, handle it in-house. If it's not, it goes up the ladder. When it does go up the ladder, imprisonment and fines could be expected. The case could also go all the way up to the king. Anyone had the right to appeal to the king. His decision superseded any other decisions that were made. He was the supreme court of the land, and he was expected to be fair. He would try anybody from the lowest in society to the highest, like his own chiefs. Author Isabaruli tells a story of a case involving the Basuli clan. This is a clan who, according to Nsamba, transitioned from a merely cattle and goat herding clan to one of religious significance during the decay of the Butchery reign. Now, it's said that a sub-county chief called Rugomoka had many beautiful wives and handsome pages at his court. This story is said to have happened during Kamrasi's time, so between 1852 and 1869. Isabaruli tells us that 2 of his pages fell in love with 2 of his wives. As you might imagine, rumors began to circulate of the scandalous events happening between these 4. It all came to a head when they were discovered red-handed in the act. Rugomoka, having ultimate judicial powers in the sub-county, decided that he was going to try this case. He set up a kangaroo court with himself as the judge. Imagine that, the judge being the complainant in a court case. This was not going to end well for any of them. Rugomoka had the 2 pages castrated and their private parts stuffed in their mouths. And this is where the balance comes into play. Yes, you have ultimate power, but there are limits. And what Rugomoka did here crossed the line. His people were so horrified by this punishment that they went over him and straight to King Kamrasi himself. Upon hearing this, he too was shocked by the sheer barbarity displayed, so much so that he ordered the immediate arrest of Rugomoka. Unfortunately, someone tipped him off and he fled to Busoga, a land that was partly under the jurisdiction of Bunyoro. He was never found. Rugomoka was subsequently replaced by the Princess Nyangoma. Balance was important. Too soft, and you risk your authority being undermined. Too cruel, and you risk the revolt of your people and the judgment of the king himself upon you. Even he, the king, was not above this. Although this act was barbaric, the king often handed down punishments that were just as cruel. Witnesses mentioned that criminals were sometimes disciplined with dismemberments. The king had a sword called Busitama that he could use to slice miscreants. It's hard to know how bad these cases had to be to result in such gruesome punishments, but it's said that they often survived, and that the Banyoro were medically skilled enough to be able to stop the bleeding and ensure the survival of the guilty. Those who were sentenced to death were killed in a few ways. There were beheadings, which were done by the chief executioner with his axe, Karamaire. There was drowning, which was favored more by the Butchery. And there was the one where the guilty would be bundled up in reeds and set ablaze only to be tossed off a cliff. As if the fire wasn't bad enough, you had the horrifying experience of plummeting to your death as well. It's almost as if they were trying to figure out which kills you faster, the fire or the fall. I mean, of course the fall would kill you faster, but yeah. Okay. I think that's enough for today. I've got one more episode till I conclude the Banyoro series. For the next one, I'm going to talk about religion in pre-colonial Banyoro. I've been looking forward to this one for a while. Not that I didn't look forward to the others, I did. But religion in pre-colonial times intrigues me more, especially given the bad rap that it gets. Native religions have come to be associated with the devil, which I'm sure many of you can guess why. And so next time, we'll talk about Bunyoro's religion of Kubandwa. See you then.